Okay, wrapping up. So we need to have a terminating statement. Very young children, particularly in a self-contained classroom where there's not bells or strict period markings where something ends, they're kind of with one teacher all day long. A student might need, particularly young students and less able students, need to have kind of those tent poles to their day where it's like, okay, now we're done. So as an older class, it might be logical to say, okay, class, we'll pick this up tomorrow, or the bell will ring, and you'll assign homework or something like that. But you need to have something that brings it to a closure. So I might say something like, wow, you really know how to recognize and respond to unfairness when you see it. That's kind of like culminating, bringing it together. Then you have a cleanup plan. So if you're doing a science experiment, you might have to wash beakers or put microscopes away or clean up material. If you're doing a craft, you might have to clean up. This doesn't really require a big cleanup plan other than like put your notebooks away. So you don't really have to, if you don't have a cleanup plan, it's okay to say there's really no big cleanup plan. Because it's important to factor that in too, because you only get so many minutes to your class period. So, if you have to spend 10 of them getting materials out and then cleaning up, that's 10 minutes of instruction you've lost, which isn't your fault. It's not a problem. It's just there's only so many minutes in a period or so many hours, in a section. So you just have to remember that it doesn't just start the minute the minute the clock starts for your section. You need to get time to get ready and clean up. So transition, again, for older children and more able children, this transition is not such a big deal. But for young children and less able children, sometimes transitions can be very disruptive. And transitions can be a source of difficult classroom management. So you want to try, well, without really making your classroom oppressive and that there's no freedom, because I've seen some really, really well-controlled and well-managed classrooms where the teacher had total control and the children were doing everything they needed to, but it felt oppressive, like there was no joy. So as we transition, you want to make sure that you remember the focus. The focus isn't to have absolute silence, maybe, but it's to make sure that nobody gets hurt, or to make sure that people know what comes next. And that's the reason that you're controlling, the environment, not so that you have absolute silence. I get sad when I go to kindergarten classes and it's just absolute silence. It's only the teacher talking. That's no good. So transition. So I might say, please return to your regular seats and we'll get ready for the next activity. If you've got young children and having 20 or 30 children move at the same time is going to cause a problem, pushing, shoving, tripping, running, that kind of thing, that's a safety concern, right? So you might just dismiss 5 kids at a time. You can do something silly like, if your birthday is in September, go back to your seats. If you're wearing red, go back to your seat. If your name has an sound in it, go back to your seat, whatever. Again, seniors in high school probably don't need a lot of assistance with that, but you never know. The 6th part is key concepts, questions, and vocabulary. So what are the key words that you must either present prior to the lesson for understanding, or the terms you plan to teach during the plan? So I listed my vocabulary again. And then you see the section here where it says formative assessment. So formative assessment is a type of assessment that you use while you're teaching. The reason you do this type of assessment is so that you can switch gears while you're teaching, give more examples, move faster if this is something that somebody already understands. So formative assessment helps guide what you're doing. So questions are the best formative assessment. Questions and observations, right? So that observation would be another great example. Watching, looking, listening as the kids work would be a great observation, as to see who's understanding and who's not. For our lesson plan, I want you to start to think about the questions you can ask. So what you'll do is you'll go to Bloom's Taxonomy. There you'll see the types of, I don't know if this is a link in your class or not. I'll have to check, because I usually have a handout. If I don't have a handout, if I can't find it electronically, I'll scan it in for you to give you an example. But you want to ask questions that you could ask to see if the students are meeting your objectives. So you go back up to your objectives. You look at what you want them to do and be able to know at the end. And then you say, well, what could I ask that would signal to me if students are getting it or not? So And then, I would like you to start to label them as to Bloom's taxonomy. So what does it mean to have a bias? So that's an understand. Like if I ask the question, what does it mean if you have a bias? Or if somebody says, that's biased. Them being able to retell it in their own words, that's comprehension. That's understanding. What is one problem with being biased? That's an understand as well. How can you avoid acting on your biases, right? That's an understand, and maybe even a little bit of an application, right? Because they have to think about what a bias would look like in action, and then what would they do to not be biased. The fourth question, what is something that a person can do to minimize bias? And again, that's an understand and an application. And then what can you do when you recognize a bias? And that's an understand and an application as well, right? Because we have to understand it, and then we're going to apply it. Maybe it's actually more understand, but it could be a little apply. So again, you'll get a better idea of what levels these are on Bloom's taxonomy once you go through and look through those Bloom's taxonomy resources. So I definitely want at least 5 questions you can ask. The 5 questions should help you measure your objective. So you can see that if I'm focused, change bias, I could put in a different term. I could say, give me an example of prejudice. What does racism mean? You can do that, but you don't want it just to be all definitions. What is racism? What is bias? You want to think about the whole scope of your objective. So if you want them to be able to understand and identify and then be empowered, you should have a questions that kind of span the scope of what you're asking them to do in your objectives.